Let's talk absolute and relative change. And we're going to do this using fair market rental rates. Now, I'm going to talk about fair market rental as FMR just because I'm lazy. So here we go. We are going to compare the FMR rates between years. So we have Fort Wayne, Gary, Indianapolis, and Bloomington, and we have the fair market rental rates from 2015 and 2021. So we are going to calculate the absolute and relative change, and then we're going to do some interpretation from there. For our relative change, we're going to round everything to the nearest tenth of a percent. Okay, so here we are. Let's go to Gary. Fort Wayne's done for us. So when we're looking at our Gary here now, so to find absolute change, remember absolute is new minus old, where old is our reference value. So new is going to be for the year 2021, old will be for the year 2015. So if we're looking at Gary, we're going to take 923 minus 805, and that gives us an absolute change of 118. Now, to find our relative change, we take the absolute change and we divide by the reference or the old value. So 118 divided by 805 gives me 0.1465. Now it says nearest a tenth of a percent. So this is the same as 14.65%. The 5 tells me to round up. So that's going to give me 14.7%. Okay, let's move on to Indianapolis. So Indianapolis is going to give us 946 minus 792 for an absolute change of 154. To find the relative change, I take the absolute change, divide by the reference or the old, and that's going to give me 0.1944, rounded to the nearest tenth of a percent, and it's 19.4. Let's then move on to Bloomington. And we take 927 minus 823 for an absolute change of 104, and then 104 divided by the reference of 823 for a decimal of 0.1263, nearest tenth of a percent, 12.6%. So that's just the mathematics of it, right? Finding the absolute change, finding the relative change. So we know that absolute change is a value, right? A numeric value, where the relative change is a percent. So now let's go ahead and interpret those. So we see that there was a $97 increase in the FMR rate in Fort Wayne from 2015 to 2021, and that rental rates increased by 14.1% in Fort Wayne during the 6 years leading up to 2001, right? That's the interpretation of Fort Wayne. So let's talk about Indianapolis. Now, from our table before, we know that the absolute change in Indianapolis is 154. So what does that mean, right? We're talking about the interpretation. These numbers aren't worth anything if we don't know what they mean. So the interpretation, we could say there was a $154 increase. We know it's an increase because this is a positive absolute change. So $154 increase in fair market rental rates in Indianapolis from 2015 to 2021, right? Basically, you're just saying, what does that value represent? Is it an increase or a decrease? What are we talking about? Fair market rental rates, and when? So if you can give those three values in a sentence form, you're pretty good to go. Now let's talk about the relative change for Indianapolis. Now we know in Indianapolis, the relative change from the table before is 19.4%. And again, this is positive, so we know it's an increase. We also know the values went up from 2015 to 2021, so there again is an increase. So if we want to interpret this, I can say, okay, from 2015 to 2021, there was a 19.4% increase in fair market rental rates in Indianapolis. That's what that means, right? It's a huge increase in terms of the rent rate, right? It went up by 19.4%. Now that's if we're looking at one city time over time. But what if we want to go between communities? So now we're going to talk about the 2021 values. And here the example that we are given is Indianapolis to Bloomington. Now here when we do this, we're going to say, okay, Bloomington is the reference. So that means Bloomington is going to be old, Indianapolis is going to be new. So thinking about the absolute change, we take new minus old, which is Indianapolis minus Bloomington, and we get a 19 Then we take 19 divided by the reference, or 19 divided by the Bloomington, and we end up with 2%. So what does that mean? Well, whatever is new is what we talk about first. So Indianapolis rental rates were $19, right? There's the absolute change, more than Bloomington, because Bloomington was the reference in 2021. What does that mean? Well, that's 2%. Indianapolis's rental rates were 2% more than Bloomington. Okay, so now let's do this same idea with Fort Wayne and Gary. So first here in number 3, we're going to compare Fort Wayne to Gary. What are we going to use as our reference? Well, keeping the idea of Indianapolis to Bloomington, if we're comparing Fort Wayne to Gary, whatever we're comparing to is our reference. So we're going to use Gary as the old value and Fort Wayne as the new. So remember, for absolute change, we take new minus old. So we're going to take the value of Fort Wayne. This is going back to our table. From 2021, the Fort Wayne value is 784, and we're going to subtract the value in Gary, which is 923. So when I take 784 minus 923, I get negative 139. Now that's the absolute change. The relative change, we're going to take the absolute change, negative 139, divide by the reference. Remember, the reference is Gary, so 923, and that gives us roughly negative 15.1%. Okay, so we calculated those. Now it says, let's compare, this is number 4 now, compare Gary to Fort Wayne. So now Fort Wayne is the reference or the old value. So now we're going to take Gary minus Fort Wayne instead of Fort Wayne minus Gary. So 923 minus 784, which gives me a positive 139. And then the relative change, 139 divided by the Fort Wayne reference, and we get 17.7%. So notice the difference, okay? So in number 3, we would say, I'm coming back up here to number 3. So Fort Wayne fair market rental rates are $139 lower or cheaper than Gary, right? So that means, so Fort Wayne fair market rental rates were 15.1% less than Gary. All right, so that's when we're using Gary as the reference. Now, when we switch to number 4, where Fort Wayne is the reference, we start with Gary's fair market rental rates are $139 more or higher than Fort Wayne. So again, then we would say Gary fair market rental rates were 17.7% more or higher than Gary. Excuse me, than Fort Wayne. So it depends on what's the reference. So you can see in number 3, because we used Gary as the reference, we had a decrease because Fort Wayne was less than Gary. Whereas we went the other way and we used Fort Wayne as the reference, well then Gary is more than that. So you have to pay attention to the reference value, because what, depending on what the reference value is, that changes your relative change. It also changes how your sentences are set up. So just make sure you're paying attention. I like to label what's your reference, because that reference means old. So when you put it in your formula, new minus old, it really helps with the understanding. Hope that helps.